You signed everything over while I was lying in a hospital bed, my lawyer said, sliding the folder across the table, his voice careful, almost too careful, as if he were afraid the truth might shatter something fragile inside me. And for a moment, I simply looked at the papers without touching them, my name still printed neatly at the top, my company's name beneath it. A company I had spent 32 years building from a single rented office with peeling paint and a second-hand desk. A company that had carried me through my husband's passing, through every lonely Christmas and every sleepless night. And now, according to the documents in front of me, it no longer belonged to me. It belonged to my brother, Daniel Collins, the same man who had held my hand just weeks ago and told me not to worry about anything, that he would take care of it all while I recovered. And I remember smiling faintly as I leaned back in the chair, not because I found any of this amusing, but because, in that moment, something inside me went very still, very clear, the kind of clarity that only comes when the worst thing you could imagine has already happened and there is nothing left to fear. And my lawyer kept talking, explaining timelines, signatures, clauses I didn't remember agreeing to, but his words faded into the background as my mind drifted back to the last thing Daniel had said to me before the surgery. Standing at the foot of my hospital bed with that same concerned expression he had perfected over the years, the one that always made him look like the dependable older brother everyone trusted. "You just focus on getting better, Maggie," he had said, adjusting the blanket like he actually cared. "I'll handle the business while you're out." And at the time I had been too tired, too vulnerable to question it. The antiseptic smell of the hospital room, the steady beep of the monitor, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me until signing a few documents felt like the easiest thing in the world, just a few signatures, he had said, routine paperwork, nothing urgent, nothing important, and I had believed him, not because I was naive, but because for decades I had chosen to believe that blood meant something, that family meant something, that the man who shared my childhood, my memories, my last name, wouldn't see an opportunity in my weakness. But sitting there now, staring at the transfer of ownership, the neatly executed betrayal wrapped in legal language, I realized it hadn't been an opportunity at all. It had been a plan, something prepared carefully, patiently, waiting for the exact moment I couldn't fight back. And my lawyer paused, watching me closely, probably expecting anger, shock, maybe even tears, but I didn't give him any of that. Instead, I reached out, closed the folder, and nodded once, slowly, as if I had just confirmed something I already knew. "Is there anything we can do?" he asked quietly, and I could hear the hesitation in his voice, the unspoken assumption that I had already lost, that this was just another story of someone outmaneuvered at the worst possible time. And I let the silence stretch for a moment before answering, not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to feel the weight of the situation settle completely. Every detail, every implication, every piece of the game Daniel thought he had already won. And then I stood up, smoothing my jacket as if this were just another meeting on an ordinary day. "Not yet," I said, my voice steady, almost calm. And as I walked toward the door, I could feel my lawyer's eyes following me, confused, uncertain, because he didn't understand what I had already begun to see. That losing everything in one clean, calculated move wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a much more interesting one. And as I stepped out into the late afternoon light, the city moving around me like nothing had changed, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, the kind that never reaches the eyes, because Daniel thought he had taken everything from me while I was at my weakest. He thought he had secured his victory while I was lying in that hospital bed signing papers I barely read. But what he didn't understand, what he had never understood about me, was that I had built that company from nothing once before. I knew every corner of it, every contract, every relationship, every weakness hidden beneath its polished surface. And more importantly, I knew him. I knew his impatience, his need to feel in control, his tendency to rush when he thought no one was watching. And that was his first mistake, because while he was busy celebrating a win he believed was final, I was already beginning to see the cracks in the foundation he had just claimed as his own. And for the first time since I left that hospital room, I felt something stronger than anger, stronger than betrayal, something colder, quieter, and far more dangerous: patience. I woke up before dawn the next morning, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind refused to stay quiet. And for a few seconds I lay there staring at the ceiling, letting the soft gray light filter through the curtains, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall, trying to remember what life had felt like just a few weeks ago before everything shifted without warning, before signatures and silence had quietly rewritten the story of my own company. And I sat up, slowly, feeling the stiffness in my shoulders, the lingering weakness from the hospital still present, but no longer overwhelming. Just a reminder of how carefully Daniel had chosen his moment. And I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and stood by the window as the sun began to rise over the neighborhood, the same quiet street where nothing ever seemed to change, where neighbors waved politely and lawns were trimmed on schedule. And for a moment, it almost felt absurd that something as calculated as what Daniel had done could exist so close to something so ordinary. But then again, that was exactly how he operated, always beneath the surface, always in places where no one thought to look too closely. And I took a slow sip of coffee and let my thoughts move back to the days before the hospital, to the small details I had dismissed at the time, the conversations that had seemed harmless, the moments that now, in hindsight, carried a different weight entirely. Like the afternoon he showed up unannounced at my office with that same easy smile, leaning casually against the doorframe as if he had every right to be there. "You have been working too hard," he had said, glancing around the room as if taking inventory. "You should let me help more, take some of the pressure off." And I had laughed it off, telling him I had managed just fine for 3 decades. But he did not argue. He never argued. He just nodded, absorbing everything, filing it away. And then there were the emails he insisted on being copied on, the meetings he offered to attend in my place, the way he slowly positioned himself closer to the center of operations without ever making it obvious. And I remember one particular evening, about 72 hours before I ended up in the hospital, when he sat across from me at my kitchen table, his tone unusually gentle, almost rehearsed. "If anything ever happens, you should have someone who can step in immediately," he said, sliding a document toward me. A temporary authorization, he called it, just a precaution, nothing permanent, nothing serious. And I remember hesitating for a moment, pen hovering above the paper, not because I distrusted him, but because something about the timing felt slightly off, like a note played just a fraction too early in a song. But then he smiled, reassuring, patient, and I signed it, because that is what you do when someone has spent a lifetime convincing you they are on your side. And now, standing in my kitchen with the morning light stretching across the floor, I could see it clearly, how each piece had been placed with intention, not rushed, not forced, just guided gently into position until all he had to do was wait for the right moment to put everything into motion. And I set my cup down and walked to my desk, opening my laptop slowly, knowing what I would find but needing to see it anyway. And when I entered my credentials, the system paused for a second before rejecting me. "Access denied," the words appearing on the screen in a plain, emotionless font. And I tried again, carefully this time, as if precision might change the outcome. But the result was the same, and I leaned back in my chair, letting out a quiet breath, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement. Because this was not a mistake, it was confirmation, a clean, deliberate cut. And for a moment I imagined Daniel sitting in that office, my office, reviewing reports, making decisions, believing that everything now belonged to him, that the years of work, the relationships I had built, the reputation I had earned, could be transferred as easily as a signature on a page. And I almost admired the confidence it must have taken to believe that. Almost. But admiration is a dangerous thing when it comes to people like Daniel, because it can blind you to their weaknesses, and I had spent too many years observing him to make that mistake. So instead I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in a long time. Linda Harper, the former head of accounting. Someone who had left the company 2 years ago after a disagreement with Daniel that I had not fully understood at the time. And I pressed the call button, holding the phone to my ear as it rang. Once, twice, 3 times, and when she finally answered, her voice cautious but familiar, I did not waste time with pleasantries. "Linda," I said, my tone steady, controlled. "I need you to tell me exactly what you saw before you left." And there was a brief silence on the other end, the kind that carries more meaning than words. And then she exhaled slowly, as if she had been waiting for this call longer than I realized. I was wondering when you would figure it out, she said quietly. And in that moment, I knew this was not the beginning of the story. It was just the point where I had finally caught up to it. I did not speak right away after Linda said that. I simply listened to the quiet on the line, the faint background noise of what sounded like a television in another room, and I could almost picture her sitting there, weighing how much she should say and how much she should keep to herself. Because people like Linda do not leave stable positions without a reason, and they certainly do not forget what pushed them out. So I leaned back in my chair and let the silence stretch just long enough to signal that I was not going to rush her, not going to interrupt, because whatever she had seen, whatever she had chosen not to tell me back then, it mattered now more than anything. And finally she spoke again, her voice lower, steadier. Your brother started asking for access months before you got sick, she said. And I closed my eyes briefly, not in surprise, but in confirmation, because that matched too perfectly with the timeline forming in my head. At first it was small things, she continued. Copies of financial reports, vendor contracts. Nothing unusual on the surface, but he was not just reviewing them, Margaret. He was studying them. And I could hear the emphasis she placed on that word, studying, like he had been preparing for something much bigger than helping out. And I let out a quiet breath, my fingers resting lightly against the desk. And you did not think to tell me? I asked, not accusing, just stating the obvious, and she hesitated again before answering. I tried, she said. But every time I brought it up, you defended him. You said he was family, that he was just trying to learn the business. And after a while I realized you were not ready to see it. And there was no bitterness in her tone, just a kind of tired honesty. The kind that only comes after someone has already walked away from the situation, and I nodded to myself, even though she could not see it, because she was right. I had dismissed the signs, not because they were not there, but because I had chosen a simpler explanation over a more uncomfortable truth. And she continued, her voice gaining a little strength now that she had started. About 6 weeks before you went into the hospital, he asked me to prepare a series of internal transfer documents, she said. Nothing finalized, just drafts. He claimed he wanted to streamline operations, reduce redundancy, make things more efficient, and on paper it made sense. But there were clauses in those drafts that shifted control in ways that did not align with what you had always set up. And I felt a slight tightening in my chest at that. Not panic, just the recognition of how carefully he had been laying the groundwork. What kind of clauses? I asked, keeping my voice even, and she did not hesitate this time. Authority clauses, Margaret, the kind that allows someone to act on behalf of the company without requiring multiple approvals, the kind that can be justified in an emergency, like when the owner is unavailable. And there it was, the missing piece settling neatly into place, not rushed, not chaotic, just precise. And I opened my eyes and looked out the window, watching a car pass slowly down the street, the world continuing, as if none of this mattered. And when you refused? I asked, because I knew she must have. And she let out a short breath, almost a quiet laugh. He did not push, she said. That was what made it worse. He just smiled, thanked me, and said he would revisit it later. And a week after that, I was reassigned to a different department, and 2 weeks after that, I was gone. And I could hear the finality in her voice, the way she had already closed that chapter long before I even realized there was a story to uncover. And I leaned forward slightly, my focus sharpening. Did anyone else know? I asked, and she paused again, longer this time. And when she spoke, her voice was careful, measured. There were others who noticed things, but no one wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Your brother has a way of making people feel like they are overreacting, like they are seeing problems where none exist. And I nodded slowly, because that was exactly how he operated, not through force, not through confrontation, but through quiet influence, through suggestion, through planting just enough doubt that no one felt confident enough to challenge him directly. And I let that sit for a moment before asking the question that mattered most. Linda, do you have anything, any records, anything at all that shows what he was preparing? And there was a brief pause, followed by the faint sound of something being moved on her end, a drawer perhaps, or a stack of papers. And then she spoke again, her voice lower now, almost cautious. I kept copies, she said, not because I knew exactly what he was planning, but because something about it did not feel right. And I have learned over the years that when something does not feel right, it usually is not. And I felt the first real shift in momentum since this entire situation began. Not a surge of victory, not even hope, just a subtle change in direction, like a current turning beneath the surface. And I stood up slowly, reaching for my keys on the desk. "Send me everything you have," I said, my voice calm, deliberate. "And Linda," I added after a brief pause, "do not tell anyone we spoke." And she did not ask why. She did not question it. She simply said, "I understand." And as I ended the call, I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of the laptop, the faint outline of a woman who, just days ago, had been lying in a hospital bed trusting the wrong person at exactly the wrong time. And I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible nod, because now, for the first time since I walked out of that lawyer's office, I was no longer reacting to what had been done. I was beginning to see how it had been done, and more importantly, how it could be undone. The email from Linda arrived just after noon. A simple subject line with no greeting, no explanation, just an attachment labeled draft transfers. And I stared at it for a moment before opening it, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that once I saw what was inside, there would be no room left for doubt. No way to pretend this had been a misunderstanding or a series of unfortunate decisions. And when I finally clicked, the documents unfolded on my screen in neat, structured language, the kind that always appears harmless at first glance, clean formatting, precise wording, everything exactly where it should be. And yet as I scrolled, I began to see it, not as individual clauses, but as a pattern, a design, something built piece by piece to lead to a single outcome. And my eyes paused on one section in particular, a conditional authority transfer, activated under circumstances where the primary owner was deemed temporarily incapacitated. And I felt a quiet exhale leave my chest, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed just how far back this plan had begun, because this was not written in a moment of panic. This was drafted carefully, reviewed, adjusted, and held in reserve, waiting for the exact situation it described. And I leaned back slightly, letting my gaze drift away from the screen as the timeline arranged itself in my mind with unsettling clarity. The extra access he requested, the documents he asked Linda to prepare, the gentle pressure to sign a temporary authorization, the hospital bed, the quiet urgency in his voice, all of it aligning perfectly with what I was now reading. And I reached for my notebook, something I had not used in years, and began to write down dates, small details, conversations I could now recall with a sharper edge, because memory has a way of shifting once you know what to look for, and suddenly moments that once felt insignificant begin to stand out. Like the afternoon he insisted on sitting in on a vendor negotiation, even though he had no prior involvement, or the way he casually asked about which clients required my personal approval, as if it were just curiosity. And I wrote it all down, not because I needed to remember, but because I needed to see it, laid out in front of me, stripped of emotion, reduced to facts, patterns, choices. And as I turned another page, I realized something else, something that had been there all along, but had not fully surfaced until now. Daniel had not rushed any of this. He had not forced anything into place. He had simply waited for me to create the conditions myself, the long hours, the stress, the fatigue that led to my hospitalization. And once I was out of the picture, even temporarily, he had moved with precision, activating everything he had already prepared. And I closed the notebook slowly, resting my hand on top of it as a faint, almost distant memory surfaced, something small but distinct, the look on his face when I signed those papers in the hospital. Not relief, not concern, but something quieter, something more controlled, like someone watching a plan reach its final step. And I stood up, walking toward the window again, the afternoon light now brighter, sharper, casting clear shadows across the floor. And I allowed myself to consider the position I was in, not emotionally, but strategically, because reacting to what had already happened would not change anything. Anger would not rewrite documents. Frustration would not restore ownership. But understanding, that was different. Understanding gave me something to work with, something to build from. And I turned back toward my desk, opening the folder again, this time not as someone trying to grasp what had been taken, but as someone studying how it had been taken, looking for inconsistencies, for overreach, for anything that did not align perfectly with the legal structure he was relying on. Because no plan, no matter how careful, is ever completely flawless, and Daniel's greatest strength had always been his patience. But his greatest weakness had always been the same. He believed that if something looked right on the surface, no one would question what lay beneath, and that assumption, more than anything else, was where he had made his mistake. And I sat down, pulling the documents closer, my focus narrowing, my mind settling into a familiar rhythm, the same one I had relied on for decades when building the company from the ground up, analyzing, adjusting, looking beyond what was presented to what was implied. And as I moved through the pages again, slower this time, more deliberate, I began to notice it, small discrepancies, subtle but present, the kind that could easily be overlooked if you were not paying attention, but impossible to ignore once you saw them. And I felt that quiet sense of clarity return, stronger now, more defined, not a surge of emotion, but a steady, controlled awareness, and I allowed myself a single, measured thought as I closed the folder once more. Daniel had not taken everything. He had taken what he believed was everything, and those are not the same thing. I did not rush to act after that realization. Instead, I closed my laptop and let the room fall into a quiet stillness, because there is a difference between knowing you have been wronged and knowing exactly how to respond. And I had learned over the years that the second mattered far more than the first, so I gave myself the rest of the afternoon to think, not emotionally, not in terms of what I had lost, but in terms of what still remained within my reach. And as the light shifted slowly across the room, I began to see the outline of something much more important than ownership, something Daniel had overlooked entirely. And that was the structure of trust that held the company together, because while contracts and signatures can transfer authority on paper, they do not instantly transfer relationships. They do not rewrite years of credibility. And they certainly do not change how people respond when something feels wrong. And I picked up my phone again, not to call a lawyer this time, but to scroll through a list of names that had once been part of my daily routine, department heads, long-term clients, partners who had worked with me for decades. And I stopped on one name in particular, Thomas Reed, our senior operations director, someone who had been with the company for over 20 years, someone who did not speak often but always paid attention. And I pressed call, listening to the steady ringing as I considered what I was about to do. Because this was not about reclaiming anything yet. This was about observing, about understanding how Daniel had positioned himself in the eyes of those who mattered most. And when Thomas answered, his voice steady but slightly cautious, I did not waste time with explanations. Thomas, I said, how are things running? And there was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough to confirm what I already suspected. We are managing, he replied carefully, and I could hear the restraint in his tone, the choice of words, not well, not smoothly, just managing. And I let that sit for a moment before continuing. And Daniel? I asked, keeping my voice neutral, almost detached, and this time the pause was longer, followed by a quiet exhale. He is making changes, Thomas said, and I almost smiled at that, because making changes is what people say when they do not want to openly criticize someone who now holds authority, but cannot fully support what they are doing either. And I leaned back slightly, letting my voice soften just enough to lower any tension. I see, I said, and are those changes helping? And there it was, the question that mattered, not confrontational, not leading, just open enough to invite honesty. And Thomas hesitated again, but this time when he spoke, there was a subtle shift, a slight lowering of his guard. Some of them feel rushed, he admitted, like decisions are being made without the full picture. And I closed my eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in quiet confirmation, because that was Daniel, always confident in the moment, always certain he understood enough to move forward, and rarely patient enough to consider what he might be missing. And I thanked Thomas for his honesty, keeping the conversation brief, not pushing further, because this was not the time to reveal anything. This was the time to listen, to gather, to let the situation unfold just enough to expose its natural weaknesses. And after I ended the call, I sat there for a moment, the phone still in my hand, considering the pattern that was already beginning to emerge. Daniel had control, but he did not have alignment. He had authority, but not trust. And that imbalance, more than any legal clause or document, was where the real vulnerability lay. And I stood up slowly, walking back to my desk, my movements calm, deliberate, because I understood now that this was not a battle that would be won by reacting quickly or forcefully. It would be won by allowing Daniel to continue exactly as he was, to continue making decisions based on incomplete understanding, to continue revealing the gaps in his control. And I opened my notebook again, adding a new section beneath the dates and documents, a simple heading, operational shifts, and beneath it I began to list what I knew, what I suspected, what I would need to confirm, not as accusations, but as observations, because facts, when arranged correctly, have a way of speaking louder than any argument ever could. And as I wrote, I felt that same quiet clarity settle in once more, steady, unshaken, because Daniel believed he had already secured his position. He believed the hardest part was over, but in reality, he had just stepped into a role that required something he did not fully possess. And the more he tried to prove that he did, the more visible those gaps would become. And I placed the pen down carefully, looking at the page in front of me, not with urgency, not with anger, but with a calm, measured certainty. Because I was not preparing to take anything back, not yet. I was preparing to let him show me exactly how he would lose it on his own. The next morning I did something that, to anyone watching from the outside, would have looked like surrender. I got dressed, drove downtown, and walked into the office building I had once entered every day for more than 3 decades. But this time I did not walk in like the owner. I walked in like a visitor, my steps measured, my expression neutral. And as the glass doors closed behind me, I could feel the subtle shift in the air, the way conversations softened, the way a few heads turned just a fraction too slowly, as if people were not quite sure how to react to my presence anymore. And I did not acknowledge any of it. I simply continued forward, past the reception desk where a young assistant who had only been with us for a few months looked up at me with a polite but uncertain smile, the kind you give someone you recognize but are not sure how to address. And I returned it just as calmly, not correcting her, not asserting anything. Because this was not the moment to remind anyone who I had been. This was the moment to let them show me what they believed now. And I made my way toward the conference room at the end of the hall, the same room where I had signed countless deals, resolved disputes, built relationships that had carried the company through years of growth. And as I reached the door, I paused briefly, not out of hesitation, but to listen, voices inside, familiar but strained, and then I opened it without knocking, stepping into the room with a quiet confidence that did not need to announce itself. And Daniel looked up immediately, his expression shifting for just a fraction of a second before settling into that practiced composure I knew so well. "Margaret," he said, standing halfway as if unsure whether to fully rise or remain seated, "I did not expect you." And I met his gaze without reacting, without offering anything he could interpret. "I was in the area," I replied simply, taking a seat at the far end of the table as if I had every right to be there, because in truth, I still did, even if the paperwork suggested otherwise. And the others in the room exchanged quick glances, their discomfort subtle but unmistakable, because situations like this do not come with clear instructions, and I could see it in their eyes. The question they were all asking without saying it out loud: who is actually in charge here? And Daniel cleared his throat lightly, regaining control of the moment. "We are in the middle of reviewing some operational changes," he said, his tone measured, almost reassuring, as if he were explaining something to a concerned outsider, and I nodded once, leaning back slightly. "Then do not let me interrupt," I said, my voice calm, almost detached, and for a moment, that seemed to unsettle him more than any confrontation would have, because he had prepared for resistance, for questions, for emotion, but not for this, not for quiet observation. And the meeting continued, but the rhythm was off now, the flow disrupted by my presence. Decisions that might have been stated confidently were now explained more carefully. Proposals that might have been pushed through were now hesitated over, and I listened, not to the words themselves, but to the tone beneath them, the uncertainty, the lack of cohesion, the subtle signs that Daniel's authority had not yet settled into something stable. And at one point he outlined a restructuring plan, something about reallocating resources, adjusting timelines, and I noticed the way Thomas shifted slightly in his seat, not openly disagreeing, but not fully aligned either. And I made a mental note of it, another small crack, another point of tension. And when the meeting finally ended, people gathered their papers more quickly than usual, offering polite nods as they exited. leaving Daniel and me alone in the room, the door closing softly behind the last person. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us, not hostile, not tense, just full of unspoken understanding. And then he smiled, a controlled, confident expression. "You could have called," he said, as if this were a matter of simple courtesy, and I returned a small, neutral smile of my own. "I wanted to see things for myself," I replied, and he studied me for a second, searching for something, perhaps anger, perhaps accusation, but finding neither, and that seemed to unsettle him in a way he did not expect. "Everything is under control," he said, almost too quickly, and I nodded again, standing slowly, smoothing my jacket as I did. "I am sure it is," I said, my tone offering no challenge, no agreement, just acknowledgement, and I walked toward the door, pausing only briefly as I reached it. "You always did prefer to move quickly," I added, glancing back at him just long enough for the words to settle, and then I left, stepping back into the hallway where the quiet hum of the office continued as if nothing unusual had occurred. And as I made my way toward the exit, I could feel the shift again, the subtle change in how people looked at me now, not as someone who had lost everything, but as someone who had not reacted the way they expected, and that uncertainty, that lack of clarity, was exactly where I needed them to be, because the more Daniel believed he had secured his position, the more he would continue exactly as he was, and the more he continued, the more visible the gaps would become. And as I stepped outside into the afternoon light, I allowed myself a single, quiet thought. I did not need to take anything back yet. I only needed to let him keep going. I spent the next few days moving carefully, deliberately, observing the patterns that Daniel established without making a single overt gesture, walking into the office each morning with the quiet composure of someone who was there by habit rather than entitlement, and watching as he issued instructions, oversaw meetings, and signed documents with the same confidence he had always displayed. And I noticed immediately how his reliance on surface appearances created small but growing cracks in the operation, people hesitating to offer complete information, minor delays where there should have been none, questions left unasked because employees assumed he had all the answers, and I began to map these moments meticulously in my mind, cross-referencing them with the documents I had obtained from Linda, noting where authority had been shifted, where gaps in oversight had been created, and the subtle decisions Daniel had made under the assumption that no one would notice, and each observation strengthened my understanding of how he thought, how he acted, how he relied on appearances rather than substance, and I kept my reactions minimal, a polite nod here, a neutral smile there, never interrupting, never challenging, because the more he believed everything was going according to plan, the more he revealed about the flaws in that plan, and I also began to check in with people quietly, not in a way that would draw attention, small conversations over coffee or in passing in the hall, listening, confirming, gently probing, and each conversation added another piece to the puzzle, a document here, a comment there, a clarification of a past decision, and with every new piece I noted how the cumulative effect of his choices had left openings that were previously invisible, not because they were subtle, but because no one had paused to examine the total pattern, and I did, deliberately, patiently, as if assembling a mosaic, each observation a tile placed carefully, the picture becoming clearer with every passing day, and yet I moved as though nothing was amiss, attending meetings, offering input only when asked, never asserting, allowing the natural course of business to continue, observing how Daniel misjudged, overestimated, and occasionally made decisions that satisfied his need to appear competent without actually addressing the underlying issues, and I noticed how his confidence encouraged small risks, minor misjudgments that would seem trivial at the time but added to the larger framework of instability, and I documented each one mentally, in writing, and in careful notes that would not attract attention if discovered, because patience required discretion, and discretion was essential to letting the plan unfold on my terms. And I took care to review every email, every memo, every note, correlating what I saw with the operational structure, the people involved, the decisions made, until I had a complete understanding of how he managed the company in my absence, how he relied on assumptions that were not guaranteed, and how, given time and the right pressure, those assumptions would fail, and I allowed myself to smile, quietly, in a restrained, almost imperceptible way, not out of satisfaction, not out of arrogance, but because I had positioned myself to see the truth clearly, to let the unfolding events provide me with more information than any confrontation could. And each day I left the office knowing that I had not lost, only observed, only cataloged, only prepared, and Daniel, completely unaware, continued as if he were entirely in control, and that control, built on appearances and assumptions, was exactly what would allow me to regain my footing, not through confrontation, not through demands, but through the careful, measured exposure of the gaps that only patience, observation, and timing could reveal. And I felt a steady calm, knowing that the longer I waited, the clearer the picture would become, and the more decisive my next steps would be, because in letting him act, I gained more than any immediate action could provide, a complete understanding, a map of the weaknesses he never suspected existed, and a sense of certainty that could not be shaken by any of the small misdirections he might throw my way. The following week unfolded with a rhythm that seemed almost ordinary to anyone observing from the outside. Yet I knew every moment was an opportunity to confirm the patterns I had already begun to map, arriving at the office each morning with the quiet demeanor of someone who belonged there by habit rather than by authority, and watching Daniel continue to operate with the same confidence he had always displayed, unaware that each decision he made, each directive he issued, was being observed, recorded, and assessed for the subtle signs of overreach, misjudgment, and incomplete understanding that I had learned to detect over decades of experience. And I moved through the office spaces as if nothing had changed, exchanging brief, neutral greetings with staff members, watching how they reacted to his instructions, noting pauses, hesitations, and the way people deferred to him without enthusiasm. And I made small inquiries here and there, always quietly, asking questions that seemed casual, innocuous, but that revealed the underlying gaps in knowledge and trust that Daniel relied upon. And with each passing day, I began to see the consequences of his impatience, the small errors that would accumulate over time, the inefficiencies that had been overlooked in his pursuit of control, and I cataloged them mentally, not with the intention to intervene yet, but to understand the landscape, to see how the pieces fit together, and to allow Daniel to continue revealing the weaknesses of his own approach through action alone. Because patience, I reminded myself, was the most powerful tool I had, and the more he acted under the assumption that he had already won, the more information I would gain, the more the natural course of events would expose the fractures in his authority, and I could see the subtle shifts in his demeanor when a decision did not produce the immediate result he expected, the quick glance at a subordinate, the faint tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible sigh, all things that revealed the limits of his control, and I noted them carefully, filing them away alongside the documentation from Linda and the records I had reviewed, creating a comprehensive understanding of not just the structure of the company, but the human dynamics that made it work or fail. And as the week progressed, I allowed myself to plan small, deliberate interventions, moments where I could test the reactions of others without revealing my own position, simply observing how people responded to a question, a suggestion, or a reminder. And each time, the responses confirmed what I already suspected. Daniel's influence was strong on the surface, but underneath, there were gaps, inconsistencies, and assumptions that could not be sustained, and I continued to move through my days with the same composed exterior, meeting with a client or two under the guise of routine business, checking in with department heads with neutral questions, letting conversations flow naturally while I absorbed every detail, every nuance, every unspoken truth that surfaced in the absence of confrontation, and I kept returning to the documents, cross-referencing decisions, actions, and reactions, seeing the way the architecture of authority and trust had been altered, the subtle dependencies that Daniel thought he had created now revealing points of leverage that he did not anticipate, and I reminded myself to remain quiet, to resist any urge to assert control prematurely, because the power of observation and patience was stronger than any immediate correction. And as the week drew to a close, I walked through the office one last time, the late afternoon sunlight spilling through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, and I allowed myself a small, quiet acknowledgement that I was ready, that I had learned what I needed, that I had seen the natural weaknesses that Daniel's confidence could not cover. And as I stepped out of the building, the air cool against my skin, I felt a sense of steady, controlled anticipation, knowing that the moment to act decisively would come not from force, but from the careful application of insight, timing, and an understanding that had been decades in the making. And in that quiet certainty, I understood that the next phase, the phase where the results would reveal themselves, had already begun. The day of reckoning arrived with a quiet intensity, not with announcements or confrontation, but with a series of deliberate, well-timed steps that allowed the situation to reveal itself fully. And I arrived at the office early, the morning sun casting long beams across the parking lot, the air crisp and still, carrying a sense of calm that contrasted sharply with the tension I felt within. A tension born not from anxiety, but from the knowledge that everything was about to unfold exactly as it should. And I entered the building with measured steps, my posture composed, my gaze steady, moving past the reception with a polite nod, noting how the assistant's smile faltered slightly, not out of disrespect, but because they sensed the shift, a subtle change that occurs when someone who has been quiet and patient finally begins to exercise their understanding. And I made my way to the conference room, the same room that had witnessed countless decisions, negotiations, and strategies over the years. And when I entered, Daniel was already present, reviewing papers with an intensity that betrayed just a fraction of the overconfidence he carried into this day. And I stood silently near the door for a moment, letting him notice my presence, letting the air carry the realization that I had returned, fully aware, fully prepared, without a single overt sign of urgency or confrontation. And his eyes flicked up to mine for a second, registering acknowledgement. And he quickly returned to his papers, assuming control without pause, unaware that the control he believed he had was now under subtle scrutiny. And I took a seat at the far end of the table, allowing the rhythm of the meeting to begin naturally, Daniel leading the discussion, making decisions, issuing instructions. And all the while I observed, noting hesitations, small inconsistencies, minor oversights that revealed his reliance on assumptions rather than facts. And I quietly referenced the documentation I had compiled, mentally checking each detail against the actions unfolding in real time, confirming patterns, recording subtle shifts, and feeling a calm satisfaction that came from knowing I had positioned myself to witness the consequences of these actions without interference. And as the discussion progressed, I introduced a few questions, casual, neutral, seemingly innocent, yet designed to draw responses that revealed more than Daniel intended. And the replies confirmed my understanding, highlighting gaps in planning, discrepancies in information flow, and the human dynamics that could not be dictated by authority alone. And when the meeting concluded, I stood, smoothing my jacket, and Daniel looked up briefly, offering a polite but measured acknowledgement. And I allowed the silence to stretch for a moment, letting the weight of my presence communicate more than words ever could. And then I spoke, my voice calm, controlled. It appears there are a few areas that need clarification. And his brow furrowed slightly, the first sign of uncertainty, not overt, not dramatic, but noticeable enough to indicate that the authority he relied upon had not been entirely solid. And I continued, I will work with the team to ensure alignment, phrasing it as collaboration rather than correction, maintaining the veneer of neutrality while subtly asserting influence. And I watched as he absorbed the statement, adjusting his approach, just enough to maintain composure while revealing the cracks in his oversight. And I allowed him to leave the room first, noting the slight tension in his shoulders, the careful pacing of his steps, all signs of the underlying stress he did not yet recognize. And as I exited behind him, the sunlight in the hallway brightened my view, but my focus remained on the subtle landscape of authority, trust, and human response that I had been mapping for weeks. And I realized that the final steps of this sequence were not about confrontation, not about dramatics, but about understanding, observation, and the patient application of insight. Because the longer I allowed the natural course of events to unfold, the more evident the outcomes would become. And by the end of the day, as I left the building and felt the cool breeze on my face, I understood that what had appeared to be loss had in fact been preparation, that Daniel's perceived victory was incomplete, and that the calm, deliberate, Patience I had exercised would ensure that when the moment to act arrived, it would be precise, decisive, and entirely mine.